Welcome, everyone. I'm extremely pleased to moderate today's seminar from the Virtual Center for Aging, Health, and Environment. Our virtual center aims to facilitate research and foster collaborations among a wide range of researchers working at the nexus of aging, health, and environment. And we do this through targeted interdisciplinary training, information sharing, and investments in research support. Today's seminar focuses on aging and flooding. Older adults are particularly vulnerable to health impacts from climate-related events such as heat waves, hurricanes, wildfires, and floods. These impacts include both physical and mental health, such as experiencing higher overall rates of mortality, injury, disruption to medical treatments. And so we're really pleased today to have Dr. Bernice Rosenzweig join us. I've known Bernice for several years now. I had read her work and stumbled across her research well before we worked together. She's a renowned environmental scientist and urban hydrologist, a true expert around urban flooding. And she's best known for her pioneering research on pluvial flooding, the flash flooding that's caused by extreme rainfall that overwhelms urban drainage systems. She's the Osilas Endowed Chair of Environmental Science at Sarah Lawrence College. She studies climate change, extreme weather, and water systems in cities. Prior to coming to Sarah Lawrence, she did exciting work through the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network. She's contributed to the New York City Panel on Climate Change, along with our CASH leader, Deborah Balk, and myself. She's contributed to the United States National Climate Assessment. And she earned her BS in geology from Rutgers University, near where I'm located in New York City metro area, and also got her PhD in environmental engineering from Princeton University. And so extremely pleased to have an expert like Dr. Bernice Rosenzweig join us today. Without further ado, I want to hand the microphone over to Dr. Rosenzweig so she can share more on her work around climate change and flood risks and the implications for older Americans. Over to you, Bernice.
Thank you so much, Christian, for that introduction. So if you just bear with me for a second, I am going to share some slides.
Great, we can see them.
Really great. Okay. So I want to give an overview of flood risk and its implications for older Americans. And often when we think about flood risk, we really think about a binary. People are at risk to flooding or people are not at risk to flooding. So I think it will be helpful to take a broader approach and really to think about what we mean by flood risk, to think about how we can consider different components of flood risk, like hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, and how those different components of flood risk can be exacerbated by climate change. And I hope that will lead into a discussion for research opportunities, particularly focused on the vulnerabilities of older adults. So there are many, definitions and uses of the term risk in the natural hazards community. One that I found is particularly valuable when thinking about flood risks is what's called the risk triangle. This is widely used in the insurance industry. It's been increasingly used in climate change adaptation research, but it's not universal. So often the term risk is used interchangeably just with exposure. Often the term risk is used as the inverse of vulnerability alone. But I think it's helpful to think about these different components of risk, that you have to consider hazard, exposure, and vulnerability to flooding in order to truly understand risk. So I'll go over those three components. There's hazards, which is defined as, a single event or series of events, which is characterized by their magnitude and likelihood of occurrence. And that's a very general definition. And I'll talk about specific flood hazards and, how this term of hazard applies to flooding in particular. There is exposure. And so, broadly, that's defined as the elements that are subject to the impacts of a hazard. But really, it's how populations and infrastructure and or property experience flooding, how they are impacted flooding in different ways, and then vulnerability for those populations and infrastructure that actually experience the flooding, how they'll be affected and how much they'll lose as a result of being exposed to flooding. So, to focus on hazard and what that's meant from a flooding context, it's helpful to think about multiple types of flooding. So, I'm going to talk about the four major classes of flooding that I've been working on, which are coastal flooding, fluvial flooding, pluvial flooding, and groundwater flooding. And these types of flooding can occur in combination. Sometimes that's called compound flooding. So that's when two or more of these flooding types co-occur during the same event. And in terms of characterizing flood hazards, in addition to thinking about the type of floods, flood hazards are also characterized by their magnitude. So we, without even thinking about it, commonly use return intervals to describe the magnitude of different flooding events. And that's just the inverse of the probability or the statistical frequency of any type of flood event. We know that higher magnitude events tend to be associated with lower probabilities. So we will just use the inverse of that. For example, for an event that has a 1% probability of happening annually, we would generally describe that as a 100-year flood, just taking the inverse. And so typically, when we think about flood risk, we usually describe that risk just considering that return interval. So, for a 100-year flood, even though it has a return interval of 1% annually each year, if you're thinking about longer time periods, people will experience that flood hazard with greater probability. So, the commonly used statistics is that if you have a 30-year mortgage, there's a 26% chance that that property would be flooded if there's a 1% chance annually of flooding. But there are a lot of important limitations to this return interval approach. So return intervals rely on implicit assumptions about flood management infrastructure. So they may assume that there is a particular flood wall or levee in place that would determine the extent of inundation associated with a 100-year flood, or they may assume that there's no flood management infrastructure in place and overrepresent the hazard associated with the particular type of flooding. They don't typically represent the hazards associated with an infrastructure failure. So they'll assume if there is infrastructure in place, that infrastructure will be operational. And I think, a really important example of that was the flooding that we observed after Hurricane Katrina, which was, not caused by the magnitude of the storm surge itself. It was caused by the failure of flood walls that were in place. Return intervals are also typically calculated for one type of flooding occurring in isolation. So it's very rare for return intervals to be calculated for different combinations of compound flooding. So, for example, if you get a rainstorm and a storm surge at the same time, flood management in practice often focuses on just one return interval. So we'll make plans or policy for a 100-year flood and not have a plan for what happens if a particular event exceeds the flooding associated with a 100-year flood. And they also, our policies also don't typically consider the cumulative harm associated with chronic flooding. So in many cases, you might have situations where people are exposed to not necessarily just a 100-year flood, but the flooding that occurs much more frequently every year or even multiple times a year. It might only be a few inches of floodwaters, but that will have significant chronic impacts on people that are exposed to chronic flooding. And you can see in that photo of a person whose basement experiences chronic flooding in Northwest Philadelphia. There are issues in terms of mold. There are issues in terms of, the stress of just having your utilities or your appliances flooded regularly. And of course, the probability of many types of weather events that cause flooding will be increased with climate change. Current return intervals will be inaccurate in the future. So when thinking about the different types of flooding, there's coastal flooding, that's the flooding that occurs due to high tides and or storm surge. So that can include tidal flooding that occurs on its own, just when you have a high tide in low elevation coastal areas, and that's already a problem in many parts of the country. It can also, of course, include storm surges associated with hurricanes and tropical storms, but also other types of coastal storms like nor'easters. And of course, with sea level rise, the hazards associated with coastal flooding are going to increase because sea level raises the floor for multiple types of coastal flooding. And so there's no set projection for how much sea level is going to rise. These are the projections for the contiguous United States that were developed by an interagency task force. And there's a range of potential sea level rises, for example, by the end of the 21st century, that range is associated with uncertainties due to, potential emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as uncertainties with how the Earth system is going to respond to global warming as a result of those emissions. So by 2100, those projections range from 1.87 feet to 7.21 feet for the contiguous United States. But of course, they vary across the country. So places like the Northeast, ranges from 1.99 to 6.86 feet. Some places like the Pacific Northwest are lower projections of sea level rise, and some places like the Western Gulf Coast have higher projections of sea level rise. And with sea level rise, you'll have increased tidal flooding. So, the sunny day flooding that's occurring in many parts of the country is projected to occur more frequently. There will also be increased frequency and also extent of inundation as a result of storm surges. There's also fluvial flooding, and that's the flooding that occurs when streams or rivers um, flow out of their banks. And in this case, I'm giving the example of streams and rivers, but in some parts of the country, you have to consider other surface water bodies like lakeshore flooding, and that functions very similar to fluvial flooding. And there's both longer duration river flooding that has to be considered, as well as shorter duration flash flooding. And both bring their own hazards. When you have longer duration events, like what happened on large river systems, you might have some warning that these flood events are going to happen, but they can be very widespread. And they can also be extremely long in duration. So people might be displaced from their homes for multiple weeks. Their homes will also be inundated for many weeks, which brings, additional problems with damage to property as a result of that prolonged inundation, mold, um, with flash flooding, of course, there's much less warning. So flash flooding tends to be associated with greater fatalities because people aren't able to evacuate in time. Flash flooding is also associated with higher velocity of flow, so that can also cause infrastructure damage. And so for both types of fluvial flooding, um, they're projected to be increased as a result of global climate change. So there's a lot more uncertainty with respect to projections for precipitation compared to, for example, for temperature. And that's particularly the case for shorter duration precipitation that's associated with flash floods. So this is a graphic that was provided as part of a really comprehensive review by Fowler et al. In 2021 that actually shows the physical mechanisms that climate change can cause amplification of short duration rainfall. And so, mostly we hear that climate change, because it will result in warmer temperatures, warmer air can hold more moisture. And as a result, when you have the conditions for rainfall, it will rain more intensely. But climate change can also impact the dynamics within thunderstorms in many, many different ways that remain less certain. So in addition to that increased atmospheric moisture effect, you can also have changes in the dynamics of storms that cause storms to be that much more intense. And these dynamics can occur at very fine spatial scales. which are really difficult to represent using global climate models, which tend to run at much coarser resolution. So there's a lot more uncertainty with respect to the question of how much different scenarios of future climate change will increase intense precipitation. And that makes it much more challenging to address. So in addition to fluvial flooding, there's also pluvial flooding, and that's the flooding that occurs when the intensity of precipitation exceeds the infiltration capacity of pervious surfaces and the drainage capacity of engineered systems. And so that is often called urban flooding because it's really a ubiquitous problem in urban areas. Urban areas are characterized by high levels of impervious surface and dependent on storm drainage systems that can be overwhelmed when there's intense rainfall. Um, Most urban stormwater drainage systems in the United States and really across the world are designed to manage only moderately intense rain events. So they're designed for the contemporary 2 to 10 year return interval. And until very recently, most cities hadn't thought much about the flooding that was associated with pluvial flooding. It was assumed to only be a nuisance. And there really were no plans for what would happen when you got a flood event that was more intense than the 10-year return interval that cities' stormwater drainage systems were designed to manage. But of course, in recent years, there's been a lot more attention on events that have caused really severe flooding that were pluvial events. And so these were flooding events that occurred, far away from any surface water bodies, but still resulted in fast-moving flows and deep inundation. So these are just a few examples from New York City alone of pluvial flooding, and that includes the flooding associated with the cloudburst that was associated with Hurricane Ida in 2021. But there have been many, many other of these pluvial flood events in New York City and other cities across the country. And climate change can exacerbate pluvial flooding in many different ways. I already spoke about climate change and the amplification of short duration precipitation, but that's going to co-occur with increased stormwater levels. And since, for example, coastal cities are reliant on drainage to coastal receiving waters, as coastal water levels rise, urban drainage infrastructure is going to be less able to convey stormwater out to coastal waterways because they'll be blocked by rising sea levels. In addition, as sea level rise and with climate change, there's also going to be rising groundwater levels, and that's received a lot less attention. But as groundwater levels rise, there's going to be increased infiltration of groundwater through cracks and leaks in stormwater drainage infrastructure, and that also results in greatly reduced, or can result in greatly reduced conveyance capacity. So all of these factors can interplay to cause increased hazard of pluvial flooding as a result of climate change. And then in addition, to its impact on stormwater drainage infrastructure, there's also concerns about groundwater flooding and how that can be impacted by climate change. So what I mean by groundwater flooding is that's the flooding that occurs when the water table rises above the level of subterranean infrastructure or the land surface. And that can include subterranean properties such as basements. And so, just to kind of give you an idea about what I mean by that, typically, the water table is located below the land surface. In some places, in coastal areas and other low-lying topographic areas, the water table might be quite shallow. So as a result of changes in precipitation patterns, the water table may rise, and that may result in the direct inundation of the land surface. But what's received less attention to date is that with sea level rise, sea levels serve as the boundary for groundwater tables. And as sea levels rise, if there is no pumping or active means to control water levels, the groundwater table will rise along with the sea level. And so that's really, really a big concern because much of our approach to managing coastal flooding hazards has been through shoreline strategies, through flood walls and barriers that are located along shorelines. And with sea level rise, water tables can actually rise behind surge barriers or flood walls, as you see in this photo. And that can cause inundation of subterranean infrastructure. The water table can even emerge above the land surface and cause direct overland flooding from the ground. So that's an overview of the different types of hazards that are, of flood hazards. And it's important to think about those different types of flood hazards and their combination if you want to understand exposure. And so the typical approach for flood exposure assessment has been to map areas that will be inundated as a result of an identified flood hazard, and then to use GIS to evaluate exposed populations, infrastructure in that inundated area. And in the United States, the most widely used flood hazard maps have conventionally been those provided through FEMA flood insurance studies. And there are a lot of really important limitations to consider with those. So they're limited to coastal storm surge and fluvial flooding in practice. What engineers do to develop these maps is they identify surface water bodies, whether they're coastal waterways or fresh waterways like rivers and streams and lakes. And then they use modeling to map areas that will be inundated in response to a 100-year storm. Um, but in practice, they only consider the flooding associated with those water bodies, so they don't consider pluvial flooding or groundwater flooding. They're limited only to the 100-year and 500-year return interval floods. They're also limited by the quality of terrain data and infrastructure data, so they can very, very quickly become outdated. And in response to those known, oh, I'm sorry about that. In response to those known limitations, in the past few years, there've been a lot of work to develop alternatives to FEMA's flood hazard maps. So there have been private sector initiatives like the First Street Foundation maps. And those are improvements because they may consider pluvial flooding, but they also are limited by the quality of terrain and infrastructure data. So in order to really do a good job of pluvial flood hazard mapping, you need data on the storm sewer system and how it operates and what its conveyance capacity is. That's simply not available over large areas. So it's really impossible to represent pluvial flood hazards over large areas. Even in rural areas where you can have pluvial flooding during the most intense rain events, even in the absence of a storm drain system, you also have to consider the quality of terrain data. And until recently, that's been very limited. But even with recent data sets that have been released nationwide that provide terrain data at 1 meter resolution, that still can be a little bit too coarse to represent flooding, pluvial flood hazard processes. There have also been other local initiatives. So, for example, the USGS has recently released a compound flood hazard mapping data product, and that includes pluvial, coastal, and groundwater flooding, as well as future projections. So that's really exciting. But these are products that are just being released and they're not available nationwide yet. And so older adults may be more exposed to flooding for a variety of reasons. Many live in assisted living and skilled nursing facilities, and those historically were intentionally sited near bodies of water. So they were sited there because that's where it was less expensive to build. They were also sited there intentionally because of the benefits provided by waterways during non-flood conditions. And even though more recently there's been a lot of floodplain management initiatives to restrict the construction of these facilities in known flood hazard areas, there's still this legacy of these facilities being sited near bodies of water. And as a result, they may be disproportionately exposed to flooding. Older adults also, are more exposed simply because they may have more difficulty with relocating. And that's, evacuation during floods, as well as, relocating to less exposed areas. But even, beyond, thinking about conventional means of exposure, I think it's important to ask exposure to what? We have these conventional flood hazard maps that consider inundation, but they may not consider other associated hazards such as fast moving water it's rare to actually map zones that are associated with fast moving water, even though we know those create additional hazards. There, are no maps of places that are more exposed to, waterborne pollutants or pathogens during a flood event. And then older people, everybody can be exposed in a variety of different ways, and that, older people may be more impacted by. So, for example, the photo here was during Sandy in 2012 when, the Red Hook housing development was flooded. And that's a multi-story development. So many people that were living on higher floors didn't experience inundation, but they did experience week-long loss of power and utilities. And that was particularly challenged for older adults. It's really hard to map how people will be exposed to those indirect effects of flooding. And so finally, there's been a lot of work done on the vulnerability of older adults. So when you consider the different types of flood hazard, you consider, how older adults are exposed in different ways to those flood hazards. They're still more vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And there's been a lot of research that's already been done on that. Older adults, may have more mobility and sensory challenges, resulting in more difficulty with warning, with deploying active flood barriers. So, they're less able to go and deploy, a flood barrier in front of their doorway or in front of their property, and challenges with evacuation. Older adults are also, in a variety of ways, more vulnerable to disruption in social and infrastructure systems. So they may be less able to get to the doctor's visits, to access their medications, they're reliant on aides and other support network who may not be able to travel and reach them as a result of flooding. And they may be more vulnerable to isolation, the psychological stressors of chronic flooding. So that's really an overview of flood risk using this risk triangle approach and thinking about the impacts of climate change. And I hope that that will open a discussion on opportunities for future research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenzweig. That was amazing. I really enjoyed your talk. We have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll take some of those, and then if we are able to answer all those questions before we run out of time, I'll have some questions as well. So everyone online, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to articulate your question well. One question that I see in the chat, the first one is about sunny day flooding in places like Florida. Can you talk about the role that groundwater plays? Is that because of groundwater? Is that because of some other factors? What's causing sunny day flooding in places like Florida?
It's really both. So
Mm.
usually when we use the term sunny day flooding, we're describing tidal flooding. And so that's the flooding that results when you have tide levels that are higher than the level that would typically cause inundation of the land surface, or tide levels that can back up through stormwater drainage infrastructure and cause inundation. But groundwater also plays a role, and that's really, really been poorly represented in flood hazard studies. Um, so groundwater can directly cause flooding when it emerges above the land surface in low-lying areas. So in places like Florida, you can have a really wet season. And as a result, the water table, which tends to be very shallow, can rise above the level of the land surface and contribute to sunny day flooding. And that's a problem in Florida. It's a problem in other coastal areas, particularly on the East Coast, even in New York City. Um, Groundwater can also indirectly contribute to sunny day flooding by infiltrating into stormwater drainage system and just adding that much more water that can, exacerbate the tidal flood levels.
Got it. And I think you explained that sea level rise also influences the groundwater table. So
Yeah.
I suppose in places like Florida, in addition to all the things you mentioned, things will just be more likely. They're more likely to experience flooding because of sea level rise too, I guess, over time.
Yeah. And so they both interact together. And they both will obviously be impacted by climate change in various ways.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Um, yeah. have a lot of family in Florida, so that makes me concerned. I'm curious. You talked about compound flooding, and you showed this new USGS tool um, that has been developed around compound flooding. How do you think about how folks should understand how compound flooding interacts with aging and health? It seems sometimes to me like an intractable thing to study or represent. Um, is it is it possible to kind of understand how different types of flooding come together? Have you seen approaches that you think um, are particularly robust or are valuable?
Yeah,
What do you
thanks. Well, just, those types of studies are just being started. And so they can
think?
include studies of specific types of compound events. So there are researchers doing work where they consider the joint occurrence of storm surge and intense rainfall, because that's something that you might experience, for example, during a tropical cyclone, which affects many parts of the country. So they would, actually look at data on different types of tropical cyclones of different intensities and the associated rainfall and the associated storm surge. They would also consider the probability that those storms could make landfall during high tides. And they would, considering all of those factors, calculate probabilities that those types of compound events would occur, both, in our contemporary climate and under different potential pathways of climate change. But I really
Mm,
think that we have to go even more broad than that and really rethink our entire approach to flood exposure mapping. Um,
mm,
right now, we tend to, at best consider scenarios of different types of flooding happening at the same time. I think we need to think about the combined effects of many, many different combinations of flooding. And then, for any different area, try to calculate the probability that it will be inundated at any particular time under a variety of different scenarios. So, really, to take a hydro period approach to think about
mm,
what's the likelihood of inundation from any of the potential mechanisms of flooding. Um, that requires a lot of numerical modeling work. It requires improved representation within our existing numerical models of these processes. But it's something that's increasingly becoming feasible and I think worth it when you think about all of these different types of flood hazards that we have to address.
see, wow, thank you for that. Um, I'm looking over at the chat and pulling some more questions, kind of related to what you discussed. Like you talked a lot about return periods, and kind of understanding the frequency of flood events. One question we have is around kind of the cumulative nature of flooding. Almost this makes me think about like how soils have memory in terms of soil moisture, and so the question kind of points out you might think that you might focus on the number of floods in a time period, let's say 5 floods in 5 years, but the it seems it's also relevant like how far apart were the floods in time. If there was a big rain event a week ago and you have another big rain event, um, are there folks are is that part of the research you're seeing, or the research that needs to happen is examining not just not just the frequency of floods on an interannual basis, but intraannually and the timing.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And so it's possible to calculate return intervals that consider what you're calling antecedent, what we describe as antecedent conditions. So
Mm,
by antecedent conditions, that's how um, a flooding event or rainfall conditions that occurred before another flooding event impact the magnitude of that next flooding event. Um, and so you can calculate return intervals if you run flooding models over long periods of time. So if you're, running scenarios that last decades and you see
mm,
how many times you get a certain flood, but you're running that model continuously So it can account for the effects of antecedent conditions and how a flood might be more likely to have happen during a wet season. But unfortunately, in practice, that's not the type of flood hazard modeling that's typically done. More often, it's typical to identify a particular storm and then do modeling based on that storm's return interval and not consider the effect of antecedent conditions.
Got it. Does that answer your question, Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this. And it's not just flooding. I mean, I think about it as related to heat, right? So one heat event matters, a second matters too, but how close they are really matters, right? Or it
Yeah.
very much changes the influence on health. So I guess I'm talking less about projections too, but more about research that tries to, if we were looking at health outcomes,
Mhm.
um, what's a better way to reflect flood exposure than simply counts, right? So for the heat exposure in some of our work we've tried, how many times in the course of a time period were there two heat events that were less than a week apart? Or something like that. Have you seen anything that might capture the timing in
Well,
in some of
yeah,
these health?
that's such a great point. And I think that's another example of why I think it's valuable to separate hazard, exposure, and vulnerability and make sure that you're considering all three, because there are the challenges in projections of flood hazard, considering those antecedent conditions and how they can occur. But once you've worked that out, then it's the challenges of considering who's exposed to those multiple events that occur concurrently. And then there's the challenges in understanding changes in vulnerability as a result of the timing of different events. So, one of the reasons that I really hate the fact that we rely so much on return intervals is because they're easily misunderstood. People think that they refer to a timing rather than just statistics. And there's often this misconception that if you've had a 100-year storm, then you're good for another 100 years, when that's not the case at all. And when in fact, it's much more likely for these types of storms to be clustered together as a result of large scale patterns of weather and as a result of the exacerbating effects of antecedent conditions. And so that can raise all sorts of very, very practical challenges that I think, provide opportunities for new research. Right off the bat, whether you've had a recent flood or not, can determine how people will respond to warnings from a flood. So
Mhm.
if there hasn't been a flood for a very, very long time, they may not be, they may not understand what the risks are associated with flooding. They may not take those risks seriously. If there was recently a flood, that also can have an impact on how they react to, a particular warning. They may think, okay, there was recently a flood and I didn't have any problems. I was fine. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to be fine this time and I don't have to evacuate, when that might not be the case at all. So there's a lot of opportunities with social science research to think about how the timing affects things like warning. On the other side of it, there's also a lot of research that can be done on how that it affects impacts. So someone might be able to respond to a flood and they rebuild, and then another flood happens and they lose everything again. And the psychological impacts, the socioeconomic impacts of a second or a third flood in a short period of time can often be much worse than just having to experience one flood.
Thank you so much. Super interesting to think about.
Thank you. It's so interesting you say that. I have family in New Orleans, and an uncle of mine was essentially shell shocked, after Hurricane Katrina. And, he lost a lot of things, and our family was affected. And, um, we have more discourse around the mental health impacts of extreme weather events now. But at the time, 2005, 2006, it was kind of not as well understood or well studied. We have a question from Alex Kulas, and maybe Alex, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question. I can ask it. Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead, Alex.
sure. I can chat. Thanks, Bernice. This is really wonderful. I think this is related to Lori's question, but I'm trying to just to think about maybe from a policy perspective or a trying to I'm new to the flood field, so all of this is new for me, but I'm trying to think about policy implications or planning implications. And yeah, is it that immediate flood event, like that inundation of water, that exposure to extreme weather, that tends to be the thing that drives impacts in the immediate, or do we mostly see more detriment to individuals like in the long run via losses to their property and homes or via mental health challenges? I'm trying to figure out like where the policy interception point might be. Is it like aiding in recovery, or is it preventing people from experiencing that immediate that water exposure?
And so I think in most cases, I mean, obviously you need to address the immediate, the acute effects of flooding. You want to get people out of harm's way as soon as possible. But in practice, most of, for example, the fatalities are associated with the indirect effects. So you can think about examples like Hurricane Maria, which was obviously it was flooding as well as other impacts like wind. But only a very small number of people were killed during the storm itself, and thousands died as a result of the indirect effects, as a result of lack of access to medication, the inability to see a doctor, the stress, and the combination of that. Even in a situation like Hurricane Katrina, where you unfortunately had a lot of direct fatalities of older people, people drowned in skilled nursing facilities, and there was even a study that found that age, being older, was the greatest contributor to direct mortality from Katrina, but there was still many, many indirect mortalities that were associated with Katrina beyond that. And I think understanding those indirect effects, how people are affected by lack of access to healthcare, how they're affected by stress, how they're affected by isolation, is really, really important and hasn't been considered enough.
Question. Great question, Alex. I guess on that note of what you just said, Bernice, part of my interest in natural hazards came from Hurricane Katrina, and when you study civil engineering, you do these you study these hazard cost relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and what I notice is you'll study, for example, a levee and how high the levee should be, or how much you should invest in that levee, and then what's the expected cost, if that levee fails. But it never takes into account, mortality or businesses being disrupted or hospitalizations. And so, I imagine based on what you said, and my own understanding, like there's going to be failures of hard infrastructure. I think you said this, but I just want to better understand. I mean, is that a gap in research? Should there be more research where we imagine hard infrastructure failing and what happens afterwards? And I'm also thinking about, not just that rush of water, let's say, that happens when a levee fails, but the fact that if there's inundation on the roads, that emergency management staff, right, can't get where they need to get to. So I'm curious, like, you know, is that research not happening, and is it possible to happen? Do you think it can be modeled?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple questions or multiple issues that you're raising there. And the first is just how we calculate the losses, how we assess the losses associated with any flood event. And typically that's done using depth damage curves. So, for any depth of flood water, there's a certain amount of damage that's assumed. And that's really, really simplistic. It doesn't capture all these really important indirect effects at all. And so there's a lot of research that can be done in improving these ways of evaluating flood losses that just, hasn't been done. Um, and then there's also the question of infrastructure failure, which is really, really limited. Usually, when there's the decision to construct infrastructure, um, the there's costs and benefits that are considered the cost of actually, construction, the infrastructure, and the benefits of avoiding losses if the infrastructure wasn't there. But it's very, very rare for there to be a dedicated study on what would happen if the infrastructure fails in different ways.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, yeah. That's still a gap, 20 years later. Still a huge gap. And stakeholders, I think, just don't want to imagine, the infrastructure failing and think too hard about that in some cases.
Yeah, and it's
Wow.
important to remember there's infrastructure like levees, like tragically, like we saw with Katrina, like
Mhm.
flood walls and their potential failures. But there's also infrastructure like pumps. And so in New York City, one area of concern is our subways. Our subways are very, very reliant on pumping. And really,
Mhm.
there's no plan for what would happen if, there was a loss of power and a
Mhm.
loss of backup power, and those pumps fail during an intense rain event, and how the subway system would be inundated. And that's the case really for any pump reliant area. There were in New Orleans a few years ago serious problems with pump failures and flooding. So, there were multiple situations where pump reliant areas of New Orleans were flooded as a result of various pumps going offline at the same time. And parts of the city experienced, almost chronic flooding for a while there until they were able to upgrade that infrastructure.
Thank you. I saw a question from Dr. Deborah Balk about different types or aspects of flood exposure. Um, Dr. Balk, I don't know if you want to ask that, or if you want, I can
Well,
kind of.
I think Alex got a little bit to the same issue on, I mean, I was just wondering whether Bernice, you wanted to speak a little bit to the, sort of unpacking which aspects of flood exposure matter for the impacts that we see. But you spoke a little bit to that, like, some like this kind of thing affects mold, but this kind of thing affects, well, this example of infrastructure and pumps and so on, this thing destroys homes and therefore people are faced with these sort of catastrophic family financial decisions and so on. So but I was just trying to see if you wanted to, because you presented so many different kinds of flooding that I think are probably new to a lot of people, that it's really useful to like hear maybe like the sunny day flooding, which can happen from a variety of causes and maybe is not like a major storm, but then, you accumulate a lot of like mold over time. That's sort of the kind of question I had in mind. But I also want to point out that in the chat, I mean, there's a new question from Jenna and a question about drought that I thought was, an interesting question. So I know we don't have a whole lot of time. So if you'd rather, um, so maybe you could speak a word to that, and then Christian, maybe if you want to like get the other two questions in. I know
Yeah, yeah.
Jenna's.
Well, if your question, I guess. Well, I thought I guess the question of mold was interesting to me in particular. Like, are there? I guess with these different types of flooding, do some lend themselves to certain kinds of indirect impacts versus others? I guess for when you think of mold versus blackouts versus pollutant exposure, do you tend to think that certain types of flooding are more likely to be associated with certain types of indirect impacts or direct impacts?
Yeah, I mean that's important to think about. So mold is more common when you have a longer duration of inundation without response. So you get these situations where you have these long duration river floods where people, their homes are flooded for weeks on end. Um,
Mm.
and in those cases, there's no way that you can quickly respond and gut all of the inundated drywall. And it's very common to end up with mold situations as a result. You also, the complete opposite, you have these situations where people experience chronic flooding, and it can be relatively minor flooding, only a few inches of water, but it happens very, very frequently, and they just aren't able to respond, and their basements or their first floors are chronically wet and end up getting mold. And then
Got it.
kind of related to that, are the pollutants and pathogens that are associated with different types of floodwaters. So, in urban areas, when you have pluvial flooding, um, just because of the density of urban areas, it's more likely that you'd have a higher pollutant load associated with the flooding. Or if you're downstream of an agricultural area, where there's intense agriculture and manure lagoons, then it's more likely that people can be exposed to various pollutants and pathogens. In urban areas, there's the concern where that stormwater is going to be mixed with sewage because in many times they run through the same combined pipe. So your floodwaters are not just floodwaters, but floodwaters and untreated sewage. Um, and so those all increase the concerns.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very clear. Wow. There is a question that Deborah pointed to about drought. And I'm not sure, Brandon, are you still on? Brandon Rueda, maybe you want to pose that question. I can pose it for you. Let me see if Brandon's still on.
Hello, I'm here.
Yeah, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. So I work for a CBO in Northern California, and we recently had a presentation done by the Regional Water Authority, who made the case for groundwater banking to fight the effects of drought. And I was wondering how the information you displayed here, especially with reference to this amplification of short-term rainfall, will affect strategies such as groundwater banking.
Yeah, so, there can be trade-offs between storing water, providing sufficient water during droughts, and then, having room to prevent flooding during intense rainfalls. But often they're not directly related. So when in places where they're doing groundwater banking, those tend not to be places that have very shallow water table. They're doing the groundwater banking because they need to increase recharge. And so there's really less of a concern in those situations that's going to exacerbate groundwater flooding in response to an intense rainfall.
Got it. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you.
What about
And
Jenna?
then,
Do we want to let Jenna have the last word?
yeah, Jenna, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. So, in the slides, there was a photo of a man in a basement that had recurrent flooding. And I actually have family that experiences recurrent basement flooding as well in the Rockaways in Queens. And so I was curious if when we talk about flood exposure, when we talk about these estimates of inundation, is it generally based on like ground level, surface level estimates? So it's not really considering
Oh.
subground infrastructure at all?
Yeah, that's the case, unfortunately. Even in the newer studies that do consider groundwater flooding,
Mhm.
they don't really represent the subterranean infrastructure like basements. And obviously, that's an issue for people that live in basements because their basements can be completely inundated. And, because the land surface isn't inundated, it's not, recognized as being a flooded area. So, there's a lot of opportunities for research to try to address that, to better represent, groundwater response to various types of precipitation conditions and sea level conditions, and how that would result in inundation of the subsurface and how groundwater interacts with urban subterranean infrastructure. But it's really hard to do because it requires observational data within subterranean infrastructure, and that's almost never available.
Thank you.
And
Thank
then
you so much. Go ahead.
oh
Yes,
yeah, I was just going
continue.
to say, kind of related to that, I think, Deborah, you had a question about different types of exposure. Yeah, and part of the problem is we don't, really know how much subterranean residences and other properties will be exposed to flooding. Then there's also the other issue with exposure. We don't know who's living in basements and how people are distributed vertically. So, there's a lot of opportunity. There's been vast improvements in doing asymmetric mapping to figure out where people are located within areas to map people to various building footprints. But there's also a lot of opportunity to map people vertically and try to better represent who's living in basements, who's living in first floors, because they'll be affected in one way compared to who's living at higher floors, who, maybe their residences won't be inundated, but they'll be affected by isolation as a result of flooding. They'll be affected by utility disruptions as a result of flooding, and then use that information to better develop flood management plans.
Wow.
And of course, if you're an older adult and you're dependent on some power supply to get yourself out of a building, also disrupted. So just a full circle here. Christian, to you for the last word, and thank you for moderating.
Yeah, no, this was excellent. Thank you so much, everyone who asked these insightful questions. Thank you, Dr. Rosenzweig, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. As we leave, I want everyone to know there's a variety of ways for you to get involved with CASH. You can actually write a short blog post about what you're reading. CASH distributes seed funding. CASH also hosts code, and you can share your code and share your data sets, and CASH will help host those and disseminate that information. I should say we'll spread the word about your code and your data sets through our website, through our virtual center. We have yearly mini conferences as well. And so there's a variety of ways to get involved with CASH. I dropped an email in the chat that you can use, but please check out the CASH website, which I'll drop in the chat also, and get involved. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenzweig, for this really thoughtful discussion. Looking forward to working with you more and attacking some of these problems together. With that, and there is a mailing list. So if you go to that website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and make sure you get
If
all
we
that
don't end the meeting, we don't need to end the meeting right away. We can stick the news link to how to sign up for the newsletter in the chat. There we go. I think.
Sure.
Right. Excellent. There you go. So thank you, Bernice. Thank you, Christian. Thanks everybody for coming. We have another one soon on housing, so feel free to join us for that. And another one on FEMA and more flooding in Houston after that. So thanks everybody. Again, thank you, Bernice. Christian has to leave. I know he had a hard stop. Thanks.
Thank you. Really interesting questions.
Bye, everyone. See you soon.